Życzymy Państwu przyjemnej podróży.
Good afternoon, good evening. We are at one of the last sessions here in the Freedom Games. I'm Magda Jakubowska. I'm the Vice President of Publica Foundation, the mother organization for the Visegrad Insight. We deal with Central Europe. And invited here today, Mr. Zoltán Kész, who is Hungarian of origin, and he will tell us a little more on a number of events that influence Central European democracy very much, but we'll unveil a little more later. Zoltán, I'm privileged to have you here. Zoltán is a former MP, the one who broke the 3/3 majority of Prime Minister Orbán's government, and because he left the ruling party. And he is a civil activist, and with a group of colleagues, he discovered or examined a situation that is happening in Africa and very much influence our today's life in Europe, in Central Europe specifically. So we'll start with some surprise question.
All right. Hello, everybody. Well, thank you for coming. It's like being with my family. I have 5 children, so when I look at the audience, you can come closer. I'm really privileged that you made it here. But the thing is, when I was walking here, just to calm myself and to prep myself, I was listening to a podcast called The Rest is History. I don't know how many of you listened to this podcast, but I was listening to the Battle of Agincourt and how Henry V defeated the French army, and then he was destined to be a great king, but died soon after. And at the end of the podcast, the very last sentence was, "It was all for nothing. All that blood, all that gold." And I said, well, this is a sign, because our topic today is Bloodgold. And when I looked at the program of Freedom Games, I found my name and the title Bloodgold. So I was wondering why you came here. What did you expect when you entered this room? Did any of you do research of what Bloodgold means, or just you find these seats comfortable and you came here to the planetarium? So we're opening up with Q&A from our side first, just to see what you expect from this interview, and then I will delve into what I have to say about what Magda mentioned, an interesting project influencing our lives here in Central Eastern Europe as well. So, what do you expect, those of you who are among us?
You can say it in Polish. I will quickly translate to Zoltán.
So the question is, the title of this presentation is Bloodgold, and I looked at the program and I didn't find any description of what the talk is going to be about, so I wondered if you're just hungry for blood or gold or both. So I was wondering why you're here.
To be honest with you, my first thoughts about this topic is that we will about to talk about some strategic resources like, I don't know, minerals or something like that.
Okay.
Okay, anybody else?
Thank you.
I checked online, so it's not fair. I know what it's about. Perfect. Somebody did the research then. Thank you.
Okay. So,
Okay, so
what are we talking
let's talk about it. So it's going to be about how, like, you're probably familiar with, there's a movie, but it's not Blood, it's Diamond, how minerals, as you mentioned, are extracted in sub-Saharan Africa, and this money is used by the Russians in their war against Ukraine. So in a nutshell, we, with a group of activists, did a very thorough report back a year ago, because we discovered a very worrying development in sub-Saharan Africa, especially with we investigated 3 countries in which it was still before Prigozhin's death, so the Wagner was well present, and how gold was extracted in these regions, and then how this money was used. I'm going to talk really briefly about these countries and the different methods that the Russians are using in these countries in order to finance their war. But when I talk about these countries, any of these countries, always keep in mind what's happening in other countries around you, even in Europe, or in South America, or in Asia, because you will see patterns, you will see similarities in many ways on what the interest of Russia is, besides the very evident reason that is getting money and financing the war. There are lots of other things. I'm going to talk about the Central African Republic, Sudan, and Mali. There are 3 different types of
Because you went through those cases, right?
Exactly.
One by one, but this is not that this job that they do ends there, right? These are only the case studies and examples.
Exactly, and there are many differences. Let's start with the Central African Republic, because that's, in my opinion, if we look at it chronologically, we'll see what was happening there, and then how it evolved into a more precise, let's say, operation on the side of the Russians in order to finance their war with the gold there. So given a country, Central African Republic, back then, 8 years ago, a very corrupt regime, in a country in which you see a lot of uprising, a lot of rebellions against the regime. So when you have a corrupt regime, the regime needs somebody to help you a little bit, even like financially, politically, and the Central African Republic was approached by Moscow back then, and they signed a military agreement back in 2016, which stated that Russia would help train soldiers, and brackets, Russia even broke the arms embargo, the UN arms embargo with this, but it was working, and unofficially it was like Russia was providing military protection for the regime in Central Africa, and by the time we get to 2020 and also 2022, the beginning of the war in Ukraine, we have more than 2,600 soldiers, Russian soldiers, Wagner soldiers, stationing in the Central African Republic. And basically, they make a deal with the government there that the money they get from the gold mines can be, well, it's basically used by the Russians. I always say that this is a so-called cash for security policy, if we want to give it a name. So this is one thing. So
what money that was involved? I mean,
it's money coming from the gold mines, basically.
Okay, but what? I mean, like.
What amount of money? Okay, so our report, when we look at the combined money that was channeled through these gold mines in these 3 countries, by 2023 it added up to $2.5 billion US. $2.5 billion US.
Only
that's a lot
in
of
one country.
No, that's in the 3 countries. In the 3 countries. Okay. So that's really a lot of money, and. So in case of this Central African Republic, we see that Russia has basically total control of the mines, the refineries, the shipping of the gold, so basically everything. So that's where they get a lot of money from. Next country is a little different. This is Sudan. In Sudan, they they buy the unrefined gold, and the way they go around the sanctions is that they take the unrefined gold to the port of Sudan and on the Red Sea. And from the port of Sudan, they just basically go to their other shipping places, whether it's in the Arab Emirates, whether it's in Qatar, whether further down in Asia or in Iran. It doesn't matter. They just have the unrefined gold, and then they sell the gold later on and
Because
get the money.
normally they wouldn't be able, because of the sanctions, they wouldn't be able to.
Oh yeah, definitely.
To export.
That's going to be a very important part of our
Yes.
topic. Sanctions would actually, I would devote some more time to the sanctions. And then comes Mali. Mali is the third country that we investigated, a totally different scheme. In Mali, there are 4 Canadian gold companies that are involved. And what the Russians basically do is they again have their mercenaries in the region, promise protection for money, and the money is given by the Canadian companies in taxes, higher taxes every year, to the Malian government, and the government actually gives most of this money to the Russians. So this is what we found by 2023, and just, yeah.
One question. So this money or these mines, those resources, let's say, are not getting into the hands of people, citizens of those countries, for them to develop, invest, whatever?
Of course not.
Okay.
Of course not, unfortunately.
And there is also this humanitarian aspect, but we can come back to that.
Yeah, we can come back to that. Now, let's just. I wanted to say some other thing in connection with the playbook of the Russians, playbook of the Wagner Group, and here is something that resembles a lot of things. Even if I look at Hungary, my country, what's happening there, well, we don't have the gold mines, but we have a lot of similarities in how Russian propaganda is going and what's happening in the country. So. First step is usually suppressing the opposition. So whenever there is an opposition, suppress it. The Russians are not interested, you all know that. The Russians are not interested in peace. They are interested in chaos. They are interested in causing chaos. Just heard it yesterday at a wonderful panel, 3 flights up there, when they talked about disinformation, that Putin doesn't want the rest of the world to like him. He wants Ukraine to be hated. So when we look at disinformation propaganda, Russian propaganda in different areas, keep that in mind, and keep that in mind when we talk about that here. So since I mentioned disinformation, second step by the Russians all the time when they do similar things is to spread disinformation. It started really early at their campaign back 8 years ago in Central Africa. Now they are more developed, and actually there's a very good literature, French language literature, to the disinformation in the sub-Saharan region, how this disinformation is causing many problems. We'll come back to that as well. And also breaking up independent media, or totally ending independent media, something again resembling my country, Hungary, in which it's really difficult to navigate in the news if you want to get news in your own language.
So, all in all, the aim of those actions, coordinated actions, is to undermine any democratic trials, attempts in those countries.
Definitely, and also when we look at the fourth step, that is terrorizing the population. And that's
threatening.
That's threatening them, basically. This is happening in these countries. Now, you mentioned the sanctions. When we wrote the report back a year ago, me and my colleagues had many recommendations to not the Russians and the Malian and Central African governments, but to the Canadian government because of the 4 Canadian companies, also to the West, because we see that if you make recommendations, even to the United Nations, because yes, there are sanctions, but in our opinion, these sanctions should be widened. So more individual sanctions should be imposed on the people and even on the countries, because that's what's missing. Also, force the gold producers and gold mines to abide by their own laws and all rules, because they have what is called the World Gold Council, which all these companies sign, and in our opinion, the members should abide by these rules. Again, let me mention one thing. We, as the people who wrote the report, we wrote to these companies. We wrote many, many times, demanded answers from them, how their operations are going, whether they are going to change any of the aspects.
Was there any reaction?
There has been no, exactly. There has been no answer. So, go ahead.
Let me come back to one or a few things, because before we go to solutions, let's say, which sanctions there are some, should be more. But I want you to show us a little more of what mechanisms they use, how this propaganda they spread, or this inability for those countries and societies to develop, how they influence or may influence in the future the situation here in Europe, in Central Europe, because I want us to have like a picture how it works. I want you to say a little more about weaponized migration.
All right. Good
and
question.
all that.
Okay. It kind of deviates from the original topic that we discussed with our group back a year ago, but we see a lot of developments, especially on the side of propaganda and how it affects even our region. The Russians set up what is called the African Initiative, which is a media outlet in sub-Saharan Africa. Besides these three countries, now they appeared in Burkina Faso, they appeared in Chad, they appeared in Niger or Niger, whichever pronunciation you prefer. And the African Initiative, if you look at it online, you will find that they even have offices in Ouagadougou, which is the capital city of Burkina Faso. I will save you the spelling. And also Bamako, which is the capital city of Mali. So they have offices. And they use disinformation for many, many reasons, not only to help the ruling regime to stay in power, but also to discredit many of the achievements of even the previous regimes. When we talk about like health achievements in certain countries, discrediting them, telling people how terrible it is to live here in sub-Saharan Africa, and encouraging them to come to Europe because Europe is the paradise. So what's the connection that you asked? When there is a need, okay, in Europe, as you all know, the main topics are migration and the war in Ukraine. When it comes to an election, any election basically that we see nowadays in the European Union, whether it's a European Parliament election, whether it's a national election or even a local election, the topic of migration is like probably the number one thing everywhere. If you look at what Tusk was talking about this week in the council, we agree that this is
an example. This what happens now in the border of Poland and Belarus.
Belarus and Russia
is sponsored this way. These are those people who are paid or abused.
You don't even have to pay them down there in the sub-Saharan Africa. You use this information so that you turn the volume up in migration, meaning that you'll have more and more people coming from Africa affecting the topic, kind of thematize the whole political campaign or campaigns all around Europe. And we have seen many examples in the past years of how migration can affect elections. My favorite example is a couple of months ago in Slovakia. During the election campaign, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the story, during the election campaign, from nowhere, a lot of refugees appeared on the Hungarian-Slovakian border and they flooded southern Slovakia. And with the help of Mr. Orban and the Hungarian media as well, again, turning the volume up in Slovakia, why migration is a big problem, why these immigrants are a big problem. But you know what happened the day after Fico won the election?
Fico is the prime minister.
Yeah, Fico is the prime minister of Slovakia, very good friend of Mr. Orban, although one is a socialist, the other is a patriot for Russia. So
both populists.
But but you know, I always say when patriots for Europe, I say patriots for Russia because they're not patriots for Europe. So there was no migrant the day after the election. They were gone.
But this was something that also built some credits for Orban in previous campaignings, in previous years, that he was building this fence in Hungary not to allow any migrants during the crisis, and so on and so forth. So these are not things that just happen somewhere there in Africa. These are things. This is something that we wanted to show you a little more. These are things that we are touching upon every day, and they destabilize.
And they destabilize, cause chaos, and also, as we see, and it's totally out of the scope of our report, but I have to mention as a former politician and somebody who cares about Europe, when we talk about destabilization and the goals of Putin, 10 years ago, Russia or Putin had 1, 2, 3 MEPs in his pocket. Now we have 2, 3 factions in the European Parliament, more than 100 people repeating the same message over and over and over again. And you see elections where migration plays a crucial role. In Germany, look at the past couple of months in Sachsen, for example, Brandenburg as well, not so much so. Like especially the east part of Germany, AfD is gaining a lot of ground. And it's not only the far right, but it's the far left as well. So, you know, all these my centrist friends always say, but it's no problem, we are still ruling Europe. But this is a trend. And when I talk about Russia and the threats of Russia, I always have to emphasize that our politicians, even here in Poland, but also in Germany, Hungary, everywhere, they think of political cycles 4-5 years. Putin doesn't think of 4 or 5 year cycles. He thinks of things in the long run. What he can build up, how he can create chaos, how he can cause trouble, how he can destabilize different other countries.
Okay, the next step. So, Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, how much this procedure or this money, to be honest, is influencing the budgets of Mr. Putin and his war machine? That's one question, and another is, like, you know, someone buys that gold.
Well, that's the other thing, but. Coming back to the first part of the question, yes. As I mentioned, we investigated that it was $2.5 billion that the Russians were using in order to finance the war. And it's a time when there are sanctions. So when we talked about the recommendations, we talked about sanctions, that the sanctions should be widened, sanctions should be used for individuals and even for countries. Believe it or not, there are 20,000 unique sanctions related to this. But the problem is, and you still can go around it. But again, I don't have to go too far, but you know, when you see how things are happening even in Eastern Europe, how goods find their way through Kyrgyzstan, Azerbaijan, all these istans to Russia, while they are repackaged in other places. Yes, you can find ways. This is one thing. The other thing, however, is that there are no unified or united jurisdictions. So one country may impose a sanction. Let's say the United States imposes a sanction, but then they will not affect the jurisdiction of the UK or the European Union,
Mexico, and
yeah.
you know.
So they can go around it happily. So maybe sanctioning the Malian junta can be a good idea, but
Can you see what next steps, because it's growing, I mean, this business, let's say, is growing. What next steps Putin can take there in Africa?
Look, honestly, I'm really pessimistic about Africa, because if you look at history and how, you know, the West has left Africa, because, you know, it's our country, we were the colonizers, now we help them, but we leave them. But, I mean, come on. There is going to be a hole to be filled, like a market niche, basically. We've seen the Chinese already going into that hole. We see now the Russians going. And I don't know if there are any journalists in the room, but one should start asking the question what the Hungarian army is doing in Chad. There are 200 Hungarian soldiers in Chad. One of the prime minister's son, but that's a different story. So obviously they are on a peace mission and stuff like that, but knowing the relationship between the two thugs, sorry for my vocabulary, I cannot think of anything else than widening, deepening this problem. And you asked about the humanitarian problems before, which, look, the leaders of those countries don't care if humanitarian crises are caused. They don't even want to solve, because we live in a world in which leaders are interested in basically one thing or two things: money and power.
Business.
It's yeah. So it's if they are good, their family is good. It's good.
So it works for their benefit, and they do not think about that.
Yeah. And when you have a lot of disinformation, when you have the media on your side in different languages, this African initiative that I talked about, now it's multilingual. So when they started back then, it was mainly French, so with some English. Now it can actually communicate the Russian messages in all these tribal languages everywhere, basically.
Okay, the picture is quite, very, very pessimistic, and showing all those different connections, nets, you know. And you said that more or less the West is not doing enough. There are sanctions, but you can quite easily go around them. How we can, you know, improve this presence before it's really too late, or before the machine is really exploiting Africa and there's nothing left sooner or later? What can we do?
Well, I don't have the answer to that necessarily. However, there are a lot of things that can be done with Russia related to the war in Ukraine. I don't have to go into details what our politicians in the European Union are doing or not doing. I'm more radical than many politicians are in many aspects, especially coming from Hungary. But my criticism is towards politicians who have spent the past decade appeasing Putin. I call them the 21st century Neville Chamberlains, basically, because, you know, they always postponed and postponed and appeased and appeased. Look at where we are now. And it's not only the sub-Saharan Africa region. Look at Venezuela. Look at Mexico. There are problems in which Wagner groups or former Wagner groups are also affected. So, but this is not our topic, but when people do their research and do their research on Russian disinformation in different parts of the world and how Central African migration to the United States is also turned up in a way, what causes that? There's a huge literature on this kind of disinformation and what it entails in respect for migration that you mentioned.
Okay, but I will try to still ask you about some recommendations, because we don't not only have governments or international organizations, not only sanctions. There are different spheres where we, even us here gathered today, can work. There are civil society organizations, different ones. Governments can support them. They can do their work in the field, or I don't know. There are journalists you mentioned. There are campaigns that can be done. We can highlight the issue. So one step is already done. Your report is there. What else?
The other step is well, two steps, obviously. The media, so the independent media and politicians. In my opinion, it would be in the interest of both the media and the politicians to talk about these issues and to highlight what we have written down in our recommendations and also in our report, because this is what's been missing. Although this past year, we've seen the European Parliament elections, so most politicians were pretty much busy with that, so not working on our issues. So what I'm asking journalists and politicians is to listen to us, read the recommendations, and do something, because they are the ones who can, at the end of the day, do something and use these sanctions, and even with the help of the media, let the people know, raise awareness, because not too many people know about these stories.
Not really.
And sorry, not too many people know the fact how interconnected everything is.
Exactly.
And the Russians know it. They are brilliant at causing chaos, unfortunately. But this is about our future. I mean, hopefully Putin doesn't have a lot of future.
Hopefully. But there's also those companies, those international mining companies. Would there be any point where we can try to reference to them for their responsibility for the procedure, for, I don't know, the human abuses?
Yep.
What else?
Yes, logically, yes, and we have done that. We've reached out to them. We've reached out also to politicians in Canada. We also had bipartisan hearing in the American Congress Foreign Affairs Committee. So we have raised the awareness mostly in North America. No, in North America, our project was well received, and we had politicians working on it as well. But here we are in Europe, and in Europe we need politicians who want to act, knowing what dangers this whole Bloodgold story entails.
Okay, I have one more. I have many more questions, of course, but I have one question that we can talk about before we open the floor to you guys. So prepare your questions. But what will trigger more this doing business in Africa by Kremlin? So, I don't know, end of war in Ukraine. If Putin wins, then will it enhance? Or maybe, I don't know, again, a migrant crisis at the doorsteps of Europe. But what may change the situation in any of the extremes?
I mean, what can finalize the situation is the end of war with Ukraine winning. I think that would put an end to a lot of things. Definitely, I mean, it would not end many things, definitely, because it's not only Putin. It has, I mean, he has his proxies. There are a lot of things that need to be happening in Russia or with Russia in order to have all these things disappear, which will not happen in the near future, unfortunately. But if things happen otherwise, I don't know what kind of future we're facing, unfortunately.
Because we normally have this opinion that even if Kremlin wins the war in Ukraine, we will have Russia still not that strong country, because they will be exploited, let's say, in many aspects, especially economically. But and they will need China and so on, new sources of money, of investments. But here we can find that that's not really necessary because they are already there in Africa and do their businesses as such.
And they have very interesting allies in North Korea, for example. Look at Iran as well.
So that would only enhance their position.
I would say so.
Okay. Would any of you have questions for Zoltán? The topic is really wide. Great. First, the gentleman back then.
Yes. Hi. Thank you. So I wanted to go back to the basics. So I was just curious, because now we know the results of your investigation and of your report, but where did you start? Like what prompted you to action? And has it started with some rumor did you hear, or some local reports, and then you decided to investigate? And then how did you grow your team that managed to actually accomplish this? Because I can imagine that there's just so much stuff to put together, and this information is not easily available. I can just probably, like, now I can Google it because you have concluded it and have written down your report, but some years ago I probably would not find any information. Like, Russia would do everything for this to not be public.
Even today, it's quite hard.
Yeah, a very good question. And actually, it took us 8 months from the beginning, when we decided that we're going to deal with it, to complete the whole report. We had academics, former ambassadors from the region. We even had people from quasi-independent media or former independent media outlets of the region who live in exile now. We had a huge team of researchers, and we concluded many interviews with people on the spot, and also we had researchers who used open source material in order to find out what's really happening, even like tax return forms of the Canadian companies. So lots of things are or were available online. How we got the idea? Honestly, I don't know what struck the idea, but personally, I was also interested in what was happening in the Sahel region, in the sub-Saharan region, for many reasons, not only because of the Russians, but even before that, when the Chinese went into that area. Back then, 20 years ago, when I was teaching at a university in Hungary, I had a seminar which dealt with Africa and how Africa was handled during the Cold War period, and how the different superpowers were coming and going. And so this interest of mine was still on. So this was my personal thing.
Okay. Lady here with the scarf. Yes.
Tak, dziękuję bardzo. Ja chciałam poruszyć.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask about the subject of migration, because it looks like Africa is manipulated, and migrants who are coming to our borders are running from bad situation. Maybe they're also disoriented. Maybe they think they were misinformed that they would have a better life here. Maybe there's really, as a matter of fact, the situation is not so bad in their countries. There is. As I'm with an organization, civil society organization, helping migrants.
I wasn't saying that actually they were only coming because of disinformation. There are obviously a lot of motivations that force them to leave their countries. And you know, when we live in the world of a cell phone, and they are shown pictures and videos of what's happening in Europe, and like it's a paradise, it's easy for them to make the decision of crossing the Sahara Desert. However, it's very important to note, and again, I'm referring back to the especially French language literature on the African Initiative, on how the Russian disinformation agency or media outlet is spreading the information which causes the migration of many of these people to come to Europe, especially to Spain, shores of Spain, Italy, so the southern part. So these are not necessarily the same people coming from like Turkey, from the Middle East. So that's a different type of people.
Okay. Any other questions? You feel satisfied with the response? Czy ma pani...
Może nie tak do końca.
Well, perhaps not entirely, because I know people from Central Africa, from Sudan, from different regions. They are not necessarily people from Syria, for example, where we know that there was war and they wanted to get to Europe.
Ja przepraszam, bo ja jeszcze do końca.
I'm sorry, because I'd like to finish, because in general, I can't say that I know the circumstances in Africa. We know as much as we can learn from the media. I wasn't there myself. I didn't see that I don't know it from my first-hand experience. Well, we know it in Poland, that also maybe this information. So my question would boil down to asking you whether in Africa, in these countries from which people come to Europe, is really the situation so bad? Is their life threatened? Or do they know that, and they are disinformed, that it's here, that it's a paradise here, and they know that they can get here easily? From my perspective, they know that there is a quite bumpy road ahead of them, but anyway, they risk their lives and they want to get here.
On this road to here.
Okay, now I understand. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, whether they are aware of what risk they are taking, and also what other reasons can there be. Obviously, the situation in these countries is not the best. I mean, it's many wars, many diseases, a lot of things that may cause them to leave, besides the disinformation factor that I mentioned. Whether they are aware of what awaits them in Europe, in my opinion and in our experience, they have very little information about. So this is something that is causing a lot of problems, especially, I don't know if you're familiar with many of the things that happened very recently on the Canary Islands, for example, when they had shiploads of people coming into Spain. Basically had no information where they were going, what they were expected or expecting to do. So yes, the reaction of Europe is another interesting thing, but especially nowadays when Europe started to talk about the migration crisis, and not only the far right, but also centrist parties, obviously from a different aspect with Prime Minister Tusk this week. But yes, this is something that is bugging people in Europe. This is a topic that needs to be handled politically, and you know, it's a very complex situation. What do you do with people who just arrived? There are many solutions, ideas of whether to relocate them, whether to accept them, and so on and so forth. It's not. I wouldn't say it's the scope of our research to talk about it. Maybe me as an independent former politician can express my opinions, but I don't think that would help to get to the solution.
Thank you. Some more questions? Okay. I'll go back to this media and independent media. It of course needs financing. So let's say there is financing, but the market is quite complicated there. You mentioned, that there are regimes. So how the Western world can try to implement those independent information, or how to inform those people when they are under regime?
You can ask the same question in connection with Hungary. As well.
I know.
And sorry to say that, but we are facing very similar. So you can ask a Hungarian why he or she believes in Russian propaganda and not what they might hear from the independent media. Just can I give you?
That doesn't work in.
Can I give you a personal story?
Go ahead. I'd love to.
Because it's really much connected to this. Because I won back in 2015 at a by-election. I became a member of parliament, breaking the 2/3 majority of Prime Minister Orbán's party, and for 3 years, Fidesz didn't have supermajority. When it came to the re-election, 2018, 2 weeks before the election, I was up in the polls by 10%, and I was like, that's not bad. I mean,
Not bad at all.
So I was kind of expecting to win. But there was a big smear campaign that started against me 10 days before the election, which said that I received millions of Hungarian forints from a socialist politician. Here is the picture, Zoltán and this socialist politician having dinner together, and how corrupt I am, and so on and so forth. And they spent millions only on smearing my reputation. And I said, well, this is not going to hurt, because the thing is, in the picture, out of the 2 men, neither was me. So I said, what's not going to be a problem? So I went campaigning the next day. I was in one of the villages in my constituency. And don't forget, it's 2018. And then people started shouting at me, saying, hey, you received all that money from that socialist politician. And I said, hey, this is the picture. Can you point at the picture and show which one is me? And then the guy said, I don't care, it was on TV. And I said, do you believe your eyes or the TV? And he said, the TV. And then I knew I was going to lose, because I didn't have the money. People in Bamako, Mali don't have the money to counter billions of Russian rubles spent on propaganda. People in Hungary, or I don't know what's happening right now, we don't have internet down here in Moldova, where in the past month, Russia spent 100 million euros on anti-EU propaganda.
But we still keep fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed for the pro-EU vote tonight or this evening. So I'm really expecting something. For me, it would be a surprise for the pro-EU group to win, because of the enormous amount of money spent.
It's enormous.
So if this thing can happen in a European Union country, in which I would say there are sensible people getting their information not only from one source, but from different sources, then don't be surprised that this is happening in Chad, Burkina Faso, or Mali, or Sudan. So when we talk about the media operations of this African initiative, this is massive. Mm-hmm. And I don't see that there is anybody or any other country in the West that is trying to counter that. They have other problems. There's an election coming up in 16 days in America, for example. They're obviously more interested in that. There is going to be another one in Georgia in a week, which we will see how Russian propaganda is played out. In Georgia, they are just showing constantly, like, their cities. Like, do you want Tbilisi to become another, I don't know, Ukrainian Kharkiv or other
But
city?
today they went to the streets with an open hearts rally in Georgia and Tbilisi. There is a number of people tired of being under the influence of Russia with this pro-European perspective. They go to the streets to manifest and make their peers and colleagues go to vote next week. Next week, it's the end of the month that they vote.
Yeah, that's next. I think it's next weekend.
Week.
Yeah.
So also, they manifest, but this is not something that the African people can do. But something that comes to my mind immediately, that the solution could be, if of course Western governments were interested to introduce educational programs. possibilities, because it comes from, you have to make the next generation being more aware, right? That comes to my mind.
I totally agree. However, this is not a new problem. So our politicians in the EU have seen the problems that Russia has been causing for almost 2 decades now.
Okay.
And I'm being very critical of many of the politicians, because when they think of their cycles, 4 or 5 year cycles, they get into their seat in Brussels and they say, oh, I'm okay for 5 years. And not much gets done in those 5 years, unfortunately. Not only policy-wise, we can talk about regulation, over-regulation, lots of things, but also politically, when it comes to geopolitical decisions, very slow.
So the center of the world has to move a little more from Europe to maybe some critical places more, right? Politically. Right. Okay. I have one more question that I really want to ask. You mentioned that what you investigated and the work you have done was before Prigozhin's accident. Has anything changed with his death?
No,
Is
it
there
has been
any
more
hope?
centralized.
Okay.
It has been more centralized, and not the Wagner. It's now called the Africa Corps, which is there embodying the Russians. We still have more than 2,000 mercenaries in in these countries. And as I mentioned, not only did it become centralized, actually under the Ministry of Defense in Russia, but also, as I mentioned, it has been widened. So we investigated 3 countries up until 2023, end of 2023. Now we're talking about 3 additional countries, and Africa is big. So there are lots of resources in other places in Africa.
Okay. So there's no hope in that Putin will shoot his knee or foot or whatever you prefer. Okay, any other questions here from the audience? We still have 6 minutes, as they say. I can do it endless,
Hi, me again. I guess the frequency is not that high, so that's why I'm asking the second question. So I'm just curious if you have any other things that you are now starting to work on, meaning investigational-wise, similar to what you did with this report. Are there any topics that you already have set your sights on? And if you do, like, maybe you could share something. If it's confidential, maybe not too many details.
That's an interesting thing, because me personally, I've been pushing for doing more investigation on Russian disinformation, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Europe. I had a project with my company for a year leading up to the European Parliament elections, in which I investigated a lot of, actually I would say all the parties, or 90% of the parties and their candidates running for the European Parliament. I investigated a lot of things, and shocking it was that there are many similarities between far-right and far-left parties, whether you have a Latvian Communist Party or a Spanish far-right party. A lot of the rhetoric and messages you'll find very, very similar and in many cases very pro-Russian. When I say, and I mentioned it about half an hour ago, that this has there are a lot of European politicians who are actually, I would say, openly pro-Russia or have been financed by Russia. Just recently, Spanish Vox Party, you probably read about it, financed through a Hungarian bank for the European Parliament elections. Le Pen's party, not only now at the European Parliament elections, but back then at the national elections, financed through a Hungarian bank. Come on, I mean, what else do Western politicians need? What other evidences do they need? So my thing is disinformation and how we can counter that, what needs to be done, how modern technology like AI can be used to counter it. Because don't be mistaken, they are ahead of us already. Because they knew what they were doing back then when they set up their strategy of causing chaos and the dissolution of political systems.
Mm-hmm. But I'll continue with this. We're now 0. I mean, they took away our electricity for a while. Now they take away our time. But I still want to ask about what's next. I know this is not the only project that you do that draws relevant to others. But will you continue with Africa? Or maybe enhance this one? I mean, like, do some more publicity? I don't know.
I'm saying we are continuing because I'm here, sitting here, talking to you, raising awareness, although our report ended back in 2023, and I strongly believe that there is need to raise awareness, not only among civil society and journalists, but also among politicians.
Okay. So, thank you so much. It's eye-opening for all of us. I hope that we'll find solutions, not only by making a little more fuss around those topics, but if you have possibilities to do it, because it's worth it. Thank you for all the work you did and that you came here and told us about that.
And you can read about the report on Bloodgold report.
Now we all know what is the Bloodgold, yes, the report is there. It's very interesting, although it's 60 pages, and I hardly ever go through those with such a curiosity. This time I really did, so I highly recommend that one.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for Freedom Games for having me here.
Thank you.
Życzymy Państwu przyjemnej podróży.
Czy wytrzymasz klockowe tortury? Ze stoickim spokojem. Czy w twardych negocjacjach zachowasz zimną krew? Czy poddasz się dobrowolnej eksmisji ze swojego łóżka? Brawo! Test na obecność serca zaliczony. To znaczy, że ty też możesz być rodzicem zastępczym. Dowiedz się jak na testserca.pl.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, But it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Radość, nadzieja, życie, wyzwanie, pasja, pamięć, zaufanie, pokój, jedność. Słowa tworzą świat. Polskie Radio. Źródło wiarygodnych informacji.
Rodzina spółek Pelion to 12 000 osób pracujących w ponad 300 spółkach w Polsce, Szwecji, Wielkiej Brytanii i na Litwie. Jesteśmy liderem w branży ochrony zdrowia. Od 1990 roku dbamy o długość i jakość życia. Pracować z nami możesz w jednym z 7 obszarów.
Polskie Radio.
Jedynka.
Jedzą kanapki z kawiorem.
Nadzwyczajna kasa.
Obrażanie dziennikarz telewizji polskiej.
Chodzi o działania polityczne.
Przygotowanie ofiar dla pedofilów.